He is intriguing, yet unpredictable. He demands unconditional loyalty. He seems to have an intuitive understanding of what people want to hear, but no actual empathy. He treats others as simply bodies or objects. And he's surrounded by a network of subordinates, but the personnel is always changing. Does it sound like I'm talking about the president? Because these are, according to Alexander Stein, qualities of a cult leader. Hi. My name is Ian Danskin. I'm a video essayist and media artist. I run a YouTube channel called Innuendo Studios, the flagship endeavor of which is currently the alt-right Playbook, a series on the political and rhetorical strategies the alt-right uses to legitimize itself and gain power. And if that sounds interesting to you and you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe. The most recent episode of the alt-right Playbook is about how people get recruited into these largely online reactionary communities like the alt-right, a subject which, as it turns out, is real fucking hard to research. What I want to talk about today with you is how I go about studying a population that is incredibly hostile towards being studied. It involves finding the bits and pieces on the alt-right that we do have data on, the pockets of good research, the outsider observations, the stories of lived experience, as well as looking at older movements the alt-right grew out of that have been extensively researched and spotting the ways that the alt-right is continuous with them, and trying to extrapolate how those structures might recreate themselves in the social media age. So it's a lot. And in the process of researching, I found a wealth of interesting perspectives that, by focusing the video on recruitment in specific, I barely dipped a toe in. And all that stuff is what I'd like to get into with you today. But I'm trying to thread a needle here. You don't need to have seen my video, How to Radicalize a Normie, to follow this talk, but if you have seen it already, I'll try not to be redundant. This talk is one part making my case for why I think the conclusions in that video are correct, one part repository for all the stuff I couldn't get into, and one part how I've come to look at the alt-right as a result of this research, including some pet theories that I wouldn't feel right claiming as truth without further research, but I do think are on the right track. This talk is called Isolation, Engulfment, and Pain, How the Alt-Right is Like an Abusive Relationship. We're going to cover a lot of ground, from information processing to emotional development, but we're necessarily going to cover racism and violence and abuse dynamics. So this is an introduction and a content warning. If some of these subjects are particularly charged for you, no offense will be taken if at any point you leave the room. I have to research this stuff for a living, and it is rough. So sometimes even I have to step away. We don't judge here. Now, requisite dash of self-deprecation. Don't give me too much credit for all this. I am proud of the work I do, and I think I'm genuinely good at it. But most of this video was compiling the work of others. Besides research I had already done and my own observations, the video had 27 sources, 3 books, 5 research papers, 6 articles, 1 leaked document, 3 testimonials, 4 videos, 4 pages of statistics. Keynote just closed. That's exciting.
You got a little too fast.
Macintosh.
I'm sorry. I just get excited.
No, oops, let's go back. Where were you?
I'm a ways. Right around there. Okay.
Ich habe mir ehrlich gesagt genauso vorgestellt. Ich hatte tatsächlich vor Augen den Frontmann von Thank You Scientist. Der sieht auch so ähnlich aus. Also der singt auch so ein bisschen, wie er hier redet. Hallo Smokey.
This is the 3 testimonials, 4 videos, 4 pages of statistics. We're going to take it slowly. And 1 Twitter joke. I also spoke to 4 professional researchers who study right-wing extremism and 1 former alt-righter. So without all their hard work, I would have nothing to compile. Okay? Let's begin. We're going to center on those 3 main texts: Alt America by David Neitwert, A History of the Alt-Right's Origins; Healing from Hate by Michael Kimmel, about how young men get into and out of extremist groups, be they neo-Nazi or jihadist. And Terror, Love, and Brainwashing by Alexandra Stein, about how people are courted by and sometimes kept inside cults and totalitarian regimes. I began with Kimmel. The premise of Healing from Hate is that extremist groups tend to be between 75 and 90% male, and that you cannot understand radical conservatism without looking at it through the lens of toxic masculinity. Which makes it all the more disappointing that Kimmel has been accused by multiple women of bullying and harassment.
Ja, der Kontrast ist ziemlich schlecht, ne? Was wir machen können, ist, ich kann den Kontrast bestimmt hier mit einem Filter aufruppen. Soll ich das mal machen? Bildschirmaufnahme. Filter. Neuer Filter. Farbkorrektur. Kontrast. Gamma ein bisschen runterdrehen. Helligkeit. So. So vielleicht, oder? Sättigung. Nee, Sättigung ist nicht gut. Aber der Kontrast, ne? Wenn ich den aufruppe, wir gucken mal, ob das so... Kann man da jetzt was erkennen? Ist das jetzt besser? Habt ihr was mitbekommen? Ja?
I found the book incredibly useful, and we're still going to talk about it. I just need to caveat here that retweets are not endorsements. Also, if I spoil the book for you, then you don't need to buy it. Give your money to someone who isn't a creep. Kimmel's argument is that extremism begins with a pain peculiar to young men. He calls it aggrieved entitlement. I call it Durden syndrome. You know that scene in Fight Club where Tyler says we've all been raised by television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't, and we're slowly learning that fact, and we are very, very pissed off. Yeah, that. As men, the world promised us something, and the promise wasn't kept. Now, some men skew towards social progressivism when they realize that this promise was never made to women or men of color or queer or trans or non-binary people, and recognize the injustice of that. And some men skew towards economic leftism when they realize that every cis-het white man being a millionaire rock star movie god is mathematically impossible. But they skew towards reactionary conservatism when they feel the promise should have been kept. That's the life they were supposed to have, and someone took it from them. Hate groups appeal to that sense of emasculation. You want to be a real man? Shave off your hair, dance to hatecore, and let's beat the crap out of someone. Kimmel notes that the greatest indicator someone will join a hate group is a broken home, divorce, foster care, parents with addictions, physical or sexual abuse. The greater the distance between the life they were promised and the one they are living, the more enticing real masculinity becomes. Their fellow extremists are brothers, and the leaders father figures. The group does give them someone to blame for their lot in life, be it immigrants, feminists, or the Jewish conspiracy, but that's not why they join. They're after empowerment.
Ja,
According to Kimmel.
Also, dass das immer so ein bisschen gay ist mit diesen Männerkulten, ich denke mittlerweile ja, dass das Patriarchat sich auch vor allem dadurch auszeichnet, dass wenn Jungs aufwachsen und auch Männerkulte eigentlich wie sozusagen in einem Kult stehen, in dem wir uns alle, sowohl Frauen als auch Männer, uns immer anderen Männern anbiedern und immer anderen Männerhierarchien anbiedern. Jungs zum Beispiel fangen damit an, in der Schule, sagen wir mal in der 8. Klasse, in ihren Jungskreisen sich gegenseitig zu zeigen, was für krasse Typen sie sind, indem sie schlecht über die Körper von anderen Mädchen in ihrer Klasse reden und sagen, die ist fett und die ist hässlich und so, obwohl die einfach ganz normale Tussis sind, die eigentlich ganz gut aussehen. Und sie würden sie natürlich nicht von der Bettkante stoßen, aber sie behaupten es einfach, um sich ihren sozialen Status gegenseitig zu spiegeln, wie krass sie sind. Und das geht dann einfach immer weiter bis ins Erwachsenenleben rein. Und auch 40-jährige Typen erzählen sich weiterhin völlig alberne und infantile Geschichten über ihre Lebensrealität, einfach nur um dem Kult der Maskulinität sich gegenseitig zu reproduzieren. Ne? Und Deswegen kommt es auch so, dass sozusagen Boys sich immer gegenseitig über ihren Body definieren und die machen das auch nicht unbedingt für die Frauen, sondern die machen das, damit andere Kerle ihnen sagen, du hast ja einen richtig guten Body und du hast ja mal voll den geilen Style oder so. Ne? Also in diesen Männerkulten wird der männliche Körper und die männliche Ästhetik auch hervorgehoben. Und natürlich liegt dann sozusagen die Schlussfolgerung nahe, das ist ziemlich gay. Aber ja, es ist eine Männlichkeitsästhetik.
Their embrace of neo-Nazi ideology is a consequence of their recruitment and indoctrination process, not its cause. But once an other has been identified as the locus of a hate group's hate, the new recruits are brought along when that group goes and terrorizes the other. Events like cross-burnings and street fights are dangerous and more
Linus, ja, genau. Wolfgang hebt das öfter mal hervor, die Homoerotik, ne? Das stimmt.
morally fraught and are often traumatic for a new recruit. And experiencing
Hallo,
an
Frankie.
emotional trauma can create an intense bond with the people experiencing it with him, even though they're the ones who brought him to the traumatic event in the first place. The creation of this bond is one of the reasons that some hate groups usher new recruits out into the field as early as possible. The sooner they are emotionally invested in the community, the faster they will embrace the community's politics. This othering also estranges them from the people they are supposed to hate, which makes it harder to stop hating them. So there's this concept that comes up a lot in my research. It's called contact hypothesis. Contact hypothesis argues that the more contact you have with a different walk of life, the easier it is to tolerate it. It's like exposure therapy. We talk about how big cities and
Naja, Zirkel, guck dir doch halt 300 nochmal genau an, ne? Dann weißt du, was ich meine.
college campuses tend to be liberal strongholds. The right likes to claim it's because professors and politicians are poisoning your mind, but really it's just that they tend to be diverse. When you share space with a lot of different kinds of people, a degree of liberalism becomes necessary just to get by. And we see that belief systems which rely on a strict orthodoxy get really cagey about their members having contact with outsiders. We see this in all the groups we're discussing today, extremist cults and totalitarianism, but also religious fundamentalists. Mormons only want to send their kids to Brigham Young. They are belief systems that can only reliably be maintained so
Fatality,
long
korrekt. Ein Maß der Dinge existiert wahrscheinlich gar nicht, ne?
as no one gets exposed to other people with other beliefs. So that's some of what I took from Kimmel. Next, I read Stein talking primarily about cults. Stein's window into all of this is applying the theory of attachment styles to what researchers call totalism, which is any structure that subsumes a person's entire life the way that cults and totalitarian governments do. Attachment is a concept you may be familiar with if you have or have ever dated a therapist. I've done both. So for a quick primer, imagine you're walking in a park with a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old sees a dog and asks, "Can I pet the dog?" And you say, "Yeah, go pet the dog." And the kid steps away from you, and they reach out. The dog gets excited and jumps up, and the kid gets scared and runs back to your side. And you hold the kid, and you go, "Oh, no, 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 it's okay, it's okay. They're not going to hurt you. They were just so happy to see you." And after a few moments, kid calms down, and then you say, Do you still want to pet the dog?" Kid says yes, so they step away from you again, they reach out, dog jumps up again, but this time the kid steals themselves, they don't run away, and they pet the dog, and then the dog's happy, kid's happy, and you're happy. Success. So this is a fundamental piece of a child's emotional development. They take a risk, have a negative experience, and retreat to a point of comfort. Then, having received that comfort, they feel bolstered enough to take a slightly greater risk. A healthy
Linus, eine Frage. Du spielst nicht zufällig Bass, oder?
childhood is steadily venturing further and further from that point of comfort and taking on greater risks, secure in the knowledge that safety is there when they need it. And as an adult, they will form many interdependent points of comfort rather than relying on only one or two. If all goes according to plan, that is secure attachment. But
Okay.
sometimes things go wrong when the kid seeks comfort and doesn't get enough. This may be because the adult is withholding, or the kid doesn't know how to express their needs, or they're just a particularly fearful child. But the kid may start seeking comfort more than seems reasonable and be particularly averse to risk and overfocus on the people who give them comfort because they're operating at a deficit. We call that anxious attachment. Alternately, kid may give up on receiving comfort altogether, even though they still need it, and just go it alone, developing a distrust of other people and a fear of being vulnerable. We call that avoidant attachment. Now, these styles are all formed in early childhood, but Stein focuses on a fourth kind of attachment style that can be formed at any age, regardless of the style you came in with. It's what happens when the negative experience and the comfort come from the same place. We see it in children and adults who are mistreated by the people they trust. It's called disorganized attachment. According to Stein, cults foster disorganized attachment by being intensely unpredictable. In a cult, you may be praised for your commitment on Monday and have your commitment questioned on Tuesday, with no change in your behavior. You may be assigned a romantic partner, who may at any point be taken away, assigned to someone else. Your children may be taken from you to be raised by a different family. You may be told the cult leader wants to sleep with you, which might make you incredibly happy or be terrifying, but you won't be given a choice, and the rules you are expected to follow will be rewritten without warning. This creates a kind of emotional chaos, where you can't predict when you will be given good feelings and when you will be given bad ones. But you are so enmeshed in the community that you have no place else to go for good feelings. Hurting you just draws you in deeper, because they are where you go to seek comfort. And your pain is always your fault. You wouldn't feel so shitty if you were just more committed. Trying to make sense of this causes so much confusion and anguish that you eventually just stop thinking for yourself. These are the rules now? Okay. He's not my brother anymore? Okay. This is my life now? Okay.
Ja, als wäre das Leben so eine permanente Slot-Machine, ne? Und jeder Zug am Hebel vom einarmigen Banditen ist eine komplett neue Situation. Und man kann sich nicht darauf einstellen.
Now, hardly anyone would seek out such a dynamic, which is why cults present as religions, political activists, and therapy groups, things that people in questioning phases of their life are liable to seek out. And then they fall down the rabbit hole before they know what's happening. The cult slowly consumes more and more of a...
Diese Slot-Machines machen ja genau aus diesem Grund auch süchtig, ne? Sie sind unpredictable und ab und zu passiert was Tolles. Und dann ist es wie bei der Skinner-Box, ne? Dann gehen wir voll rein. Wenn es unpredictable ist und trotzdem ab und zu positiv, dann fangen wir auch an, das Leid zu genießen, weil irgendwann wird es kontrastiert durch irgendwas Positives. Aber es ist random. Und das spricht irgendwie unser Suchtzentrum an.
Recruit's life and tightly controls access to relationships outside the cult, because the biggest threat to a disorganized attachment relationship is having a separate, securely attached point of comfort. At this point, I said, hold up. You're telling me cults recruit by offering people community and purpose in times of need, become the focal point of their entire lives, estrange them from all outside perspectives, and then cause emotional distress that paradoxically makes them more committed because they have nowhere else to go for support? Isn't that exactly how Kimmel described joining a hate group? Now, these are commonalities. It's not a one-to-one comparison. A cult is far more organized and rigidly controlled than a hate group. But Stein points out that the dynamic of isolation, engulfment, and pain is the same dynamic as an abusive relationship. The difference is just scale. A cult is functionally a single person having a very complex domestic abuse situation with a whole lot of people. Hashtag bad polyamory.
Yeah.
So if we posit a spectrum with domestic abuse on one end and cults and totalitarianism on the other, I started wondering, could we put extremist groups like ISIS and Aryan nations around here? And if so, where would we put the alt-right? Now, I have to tread carefully here. There are reasons this talk is called How the Alt-Right is Like an Abusive Relationship and not How the Alt-Right is Like a Cult, because the moment you say the second thing, a lot of people will stop listening to you. Our conception of cults and totalitarianism is way more controlled and structured than a pack of loud, racist assholes on the internet. But we're not talking about organizational structure. We're talking about a relationship, an emotional dynamic that Stein calls anxious dependency, which fosters an irrational loyalty to people who are bad for you and gets you to adopt an ideology you would have previously rejected. I would also love to go on a rant puncturing the idea that cultists and fascists are organized, pointing out that this notion is itself propaganda. Their systems are notoriously corrupt and mismanaged, but we don't have time. Ask me about it in the Q&A if you want to hear me go off. So I started looking through what I knew and what I could find about the alt-right to see if I could spot this same pattern of isolation, engulfment, and pain online, funneling people to the alt-right. And I did not come up short. Isolation? Well, the alt-right traffics in all the same dehumanizing narratives about their enemies as Kimmel's hate groups. Like, the worst things you can imagine a human being saying about a group of people are said every day in these forums. They often berate and harass each other for any perceived sympathies towards the other side. They also regularly harass people from the other side off of platforms and falsely report their tweets, posts, and videos as terrorism to get them taken down. This has happened to me, incidentally. I found figureheads adored by the alt-right who expressly tell people to cut ties with liberal family members. We talked before about contact hypothesis. There's also this idea called parasocial contact hypothesis. A parasocial relationship is a strong emotional connection that only goes one way. Like if you really love my videos and you started to think of me like almost as a friend, even though I don't know you exist.
Ja, das ist das, was ihr hier empfinden sollt bei mir. So nämlich.
Yeah, parasocial relationship. They've been in the discourse lately, largely thanks to my friend Shannon Strucci, making a really great video about them. You should check it out. I make a cameo, but clear your schedule. It's 2 hours long. Parasocial contact hypothesis is this phenomenon where if people form parasocial feelings for public figures or even fictional characters, and those people and characters happen to be black, white audiences become less racist, similar to how they would if they had black friends. Your logical brain knows that these are strangers, but the lizard brain doesn't know the difference between empathy for a queer person and empathy for a queer character in a video game. So of course the alt-right makes a big stink about queer characters in video games and leads boycotts against forced diversity because diverse media is bad for recruitment. Engulfment? Well, I learned way too much about how the alt-right will overtake your entire internet life. There was a paper made the rounds last year by Rebecca Lewis charting the interconnectedness of conservative YouTube. Reactionaries really... It would help for this slide if it was actually on screen. How do I go back? Here we go. Okay, it's not going to happen. Reactionaries really hated this paper because it said things they didn't like. Lewis argues that once you enter what she calls the alternative influence network, it tends to keep you inside. Start with some YouTuber conservatives like, but who is branded as a moderate or even a classic liberal. Take someone like Dave Rubin. Call Dave Rubin alt-right and people yell at you. I speak from experience. Well, Dave Rubin has had Jordan Peterson on his show. So if you watch Rubin, Peterson ends up in your recommendations. Peterson has been on the Joe Rogan show, so you watch Peterson and Rogan ends up in your recommendations. And Rogan has interviewed Gavin McInnes, so you watch Rogan, McInnes ends up in your recommendations. Gavin McInnes is the head of the Proud Boys, a self-described Western chauvinist organization that's mostly known for beating up liberals and leftists.
Roschbasch, Kommandante. Wir haben gerade eben noch was über die PKK geguckt. Von Arte.
They have ties to neo-fascist groups like Identity Europa and neo-fascist militias like the Oath Keepers. They run security for white nationalists when they give speeches, and their lawyer just went on record saying that he identifies as a fascist. And if you're one of these kids that has YouTube on in the background with autoplay enabled and you're watching Dave Rubin, you might be as few as 3 videos away from watching Gavin McInnes. There's a lot of talk these days about how algorithms funnel people towards the right, and it's not wrong, but it's an oversimplification. The real problem is that the right knows how to hijack algorithms.
Also, ich meine, nur falls es dich interessiert, ich meine, du hast ja wahrscheinlich eine gefestigte und fundierte Meinung, nicht so wie wir hier. Gehe ich jetzt mal davon aus.
I also learned about the curation search radicalization spiral from a piece by Mike Caulfield. Caulfield uses the horrific example of Dylan Roof. You remember him? Shot up a church in a black neighborhood a few years ago. Roof says he was radicalized when he Googled black on white crime and saw the results. Now, if you search the phrase crime statistics by demographic, you will find fairly nonpartisan results that show that most crimes are committed against the members of the perpetrator's own race, and black people commit crimes against white people at about the same rate as any two demographics. But that specific phrase, black on white crime, is used almost exclusively by white racists. And so Roof's first hit wasn't a database of crime statistics, it was the Council of Conservative Citizens. Now, the CCC is an outgrowth of the white citizens' councils of the 50s and 60s, which rebranded in '85. They publish bogus statistics that paint black people as uniquely violent, and they introduce a number of other politically loaded phrases, like, say, Muslim fertility rates, that nonpartisan sites don't use. And so if Roof Googles them as well, he gets similarly weighted results. Now, I've got tons more examples of this stuff. I literally don't have time to show it all. Like, have you heard of Google bombing? That's a thing I didn't know existed. The point is, the same way search engines tailor your results to what they think you want, once you scratch the surface of the alt-right, they are highly adept at making it so whenever you go online, their version of reality is all you know and all you see. Finally, pain. This was
Ja, aber das hat aber nur was mit den Cookies und dem Überwachungskapitalismus zu tun, den Google macht. Ne? Also Google ist ja dann im Wesentlichen das gleiche wie YouTube, das wissen wir ja sowieso und von daher ist das nicht verwunderlich.
the difficult one. Can you create a disorganized attachment relationship?
Außerdem zahlt ja sozusagen SEO Optimization und den ganzen anderen Bullshit, wie die sozusagen die Google-Metriken hacken, das ist ja alles, was Rechte und Marketing-Wichser und FDP-Menschen vereint, die zahlen ja für sowas auch.
Over the internet with a largely faceless and decentralized movement. I pitched the idea to one of the researchers I spoke to, and he said, "That sounds very plausible and nearly impossible to research." You see, cults and hate groups, they don't want to talk to researchers any more than the alt-right wants to talk to me. Stein and Kimmel get their data by speaking to formers, people who've exited these movements and are all too happy to share how horrible they were. But the alt-right is still very young, and there just aren't that many formers yet. I found some testimonials, and they mostly back up my hypothesis, but there's not enough that I could call them statistically significant. So I had to look at where the data was. My fellow YouTuber ContraPoints made a video last year, in my opinion, probably her best one, about incels. That's involuntary celibate, men who can't get laid. Incel forums tend to be deeply misogynistic and anti-feminist, and have a high overlap with the alt-right. If you remember Elliot Rodger, he was an incel. Contra's observation is that these forums are incredibly fatalistic. You are too ugly and women too shallow for you to ever have sex, so you should just give up. She described a certain...
Ja, ContraPoints ist großartig, ne? Ich habe irgendwie... Also... Das sind immer so Sachen, da finde ich es immer ein bisschen schade, dass ich wirklich keine Zeit habe, irgendwie lange Video-Essays zu gucken. Das liegt wahrscheinlich auch daran, dass ich selber welche mache und dann irgendwie keine Zeit mehr habe, mir noch ein 50-Minuten-Video von jemand anders reinzuziehen. Ne? Außer hier, wenn ich mit euch zusammen Dokus gucke. Aber ich denke irgendwie in diesem Twitch-Game jetzt hier besonders vielen englischen Content zu gucken, außer jetzt das, weil JJ halt sich das gewünscht hat, versuche ich eigentlich zu vermeiden, außer vielleicht mal einen Joscha Bach-Talk hin und wieder.
Catharsis, like picking at a really painful scab in hearing other people voice your worst fears. But there was no uplift. These communities seem to have a zero-tolerance policy for optimism. She likened it to some deeply unhealthy trans forums she used to visit where people just wallowed in their own dysphoria. And I remembered the forums I researched 5 years ago in preparation for my video on Gamergate. If you don't know what Gamergate was, I will not rob you of your precious innocence. But in a lot of ways, Gamergate was the trial run for what the alt-right has become. These forums were full of angry guys surrounding themselves with people saying, "You are right to be angry." And yeah, if everywhere else you go treats your anger as invalid, that scratches an itch. But I never saw any of them calm down. Like, they came in angry, and they left angrier, and most didn't have anywhere else to vent, so back they came.
Ja.
I found a paper on alt-right forums.
Also ich habe diese Entwicklung an mir selber beobachtet, einfach weil in der 11. und 12. Klasse im Ethikunterricht ich immer weiter Richtung Totalitarismus und Euthanasie und so argumentiert habe, einfach weil ich keine andere Lösung gesehen habe. Ne? Man entwickelt automatisch Fatalismus, wenn man aus dem Tunnelblick nicht rauskommt, den man ja normalerweise als Boy hat, weil man ja sozusagen dem spieltheoretischen linearen Denken man kommt da nicht weg von. Ne? Und dann ist sozusagen der Fatalismus eine ganz normale Situation, in die man reinkonvergiert. Ich meine, ich habe ja jetzt noch die Tendenz, so zu reden, ne? Immer so zu sagen, das ist so und daraus folgt das und das ist dann safe, da gibt es gar keinen Gegen, das ist 100% gilt das und so, ne? Also ich benutze ja selbst noch sozusagen dieses Vokabular, was ich noch sozusagen von vor 15 Jahren geerbt habe.
Similar type of nihilism and another on 8chan. What humor was on these sites was always shocking and furiously punching down and deeply self-referential. But it didn't seem like anyone was expected to laugh anymore, just, catch the reference. I found one testimonial saying that having healthy relationships in these spaces is functionally impossible, and one former I talked to said, yeah, when the alt-right isn't winning, everyone's miserable. So I think it might fit. The place they go for relief also makes them unhappy, so they come back to get relief again, and it just repeats. Same reason people stay with abusers. I want to look into this further, so I'm just going to say this part to the camera. If there are any researchers watching and you want to study this, get at me. Innuendo Studios on Twitter. Finally, I read Alt America by David Neiwert, a supremely useful book that I highly recommend if you want to know how the alt-right is a natural outgrowth of the militia and patriot movements of the 90s and early 2000s, not to mention the Tea Party.
Klar.
Neiwert also does an excellent job illustrating how conspiracism serves to fill in the gap between the complexity of the modern world and the comparative simplicity of the might makes right worldview of fascism. Neiwert also provides an interesting piece of the puzzle, suggesting what people are actually looking for when they get recruited. He references work done by John Barg and Caitlin McKenna on identity demarginalization. Barg and McKenna look at the internet habits of people whose identities are both devalued by society and invisible. And by invisible, what I mean is, okay, if you're a person of color, our society devalues your identity, but you can look around a room and, within a certain margin of error, see who else is POC and form community with them if you wish. But if you're queer, you can't see who else in the room is queer. Unless one of you runs up a flag.
Richtig, genau. Letztens bei Mick und Stefan haben sie diesen Clip gezeigt, ne? Mit dem Typen, der irgendwo in seinem Garten sitzt oder auf einer Plantage und dem geht's richtig gut materiell und er ist trotzdem völlig sinnlos am Ragen und am Haten, weil er in irgendwelchen Internetblasen drin sitzt, die ihm eine Hyperrealität sozusagen konstruiert haben, indem er süchtig wird, danach sich schlecht zu fühlen. Genau, das war die Beobachtung von Stefan und Mick, ne? Und das ist genau das. Das ist irgendwie auch, also im Prinzip sind die Deutschen dafür auch perfekt geeignet, weil die Deutschen sich ja schon sowieso super gerne in ihrem Elend laben und sich sozusagen darüber aufregen, wie scheiße alles ist und sich über andere Menschen aufregen und so. Das ist ja quasi im Deutschtum voll drin. Wir haben halt, wie gesagt, das epigenetische Trauma vom Holocaust nicht verarbeitet und deswegen haben wir den Stock im Arsch des Todes. Das fühlt sich einfach so an, ne, für die.
Risk that you've misread the signals and the person you're revealing yourself to isn't only not queer, but a homophobe. According to Barg and McKenna, people in this situation are much more likely to seek online spaces that self-select for that identity. A fan forum for RuPaul's Drag Race is maybe a safer place to come out and find community. And people tend to get very emotionally tied to these online spaces where they can be themselves. Neiwert points out that the same phenomenon happens among privileged people who have identities that are devalued even as they're not actually oppressed. Say, nerds, or conservatives in liberal towns, or men who don't fit traditional notions of masculinity. They are also likely to deeply invest themselves in online spaces made for them. And if the far right can build such a community, or get a foothold in one that already exists, it is very easy to channel that sense of marginalization into Durden syndrome. I connected this with Rebecca Lewis's observation that the alternative influence network tends to present itself as nerd-focused life advice first and politics second, and the long history of reactionaries recruiting from fandoms. So I can see all the pieces of this abuse dynamic being recreated here. Offer you something you need, estrange you from other perspectives and healthy relationships, overtake your life, and provoke emotional distress that makes you seek comfort that only your abuser is offering. And I found a lot more parallels than what I'm sharing right now. I only have half an hour. But the thing that's missing, that's usually central to such a system, is an abusive relationship orbits around the abuser, a cult around the cult leader, a totalitarian government around a dictator. They are built to serve the whims of an individual. But I look at the ad hoc nature of the alt-right, and I have to ask, who is the architect? I can see a lot of people profiting off of this structure. Our current president wrote it to great success, but he didn't build it. It predates him.
Genau. Ich würde argumentieren, es emergiert einfach aus dem Wettbewerb. Ne? Wir wissen, dass alle die negativen Gefühle haben die steilen Response-Flanken und das starke Response-Signal. Deswegen funktioniert Twitter so, wie es funktioniert. Ne? Und es ist immer leichter, sich abzugrenzen von etwas, als sich für etwas auszusprechen. Einfach, weil es leichter ist. Und wenn etwas leichter ist, ist es auch leichter zu verdauen. Und es ist etwas, was leichter in der Attention Economy durchgeht. Ne? Es gibt diese Alternativen dazu, aber die gewinnen halt im Wettbewerb nicht.
It's more like Kimmel's hate groups, which don't promote an individual so much as a class of individuals. But even then, their structure is much more deliberate, designed, where the alt-right seems almost improvised. Well, one observation I took from Stein is that cult recruiters often rely on two different kinds of propaganda, the winding diatribe and the thought-terminating cliche. The diatribe is when someone talks at length, sounds smart, and seems to know what they're talking about, but isn't actually making any sense. And the thought-terminating cliche comes from Robert J. Lifton's studies into brainwashing. So when I went vegetarian in middle school, I would sometimes tell other kids I was vegetarian, and sometimes they'd get really defensive with me and say things like, humans aren't meant to be vegetarian, it's the food chain. Now saying it's the food chain isn't meant to be a good argument, it's meant to communicate I have said something so axiomatically true that the argument need not continue. That's a thought-terminating cliche, something that may not be true, but feels true and gives you permission to think about something else. Both of these techniques rely on what's called peripheral root processing. So I'm up here talking about politics, and Solidarity Lowell, you are a group of politically engaged people, so you probably have...
Ja, also so Frauen-Hater-Communities, wo sie sich gegenseitig so Clips zeigen, wie blöd Frauen sind und dann haten alle drauf. Das ist eine normale narzisstische Zwangsstörung fast, ne? Also sich abzutrennen gegenüber einer Outgroup und sie wirklich schlecht zu machen und sich darüber zu positionieren, ist klassischer Narzissmus, ne?
Have enough context to know whether I'm talking out of my ass. That's direct root processing, where you can judge the contents of my argument. But if I were up here talking about string theory, you might not know whether I was talking out of my ass because there's only so many people on Earth who understand string theory. So then you might look at secondary characteristics of my argument. The fact that I've been invited to speak on string theory implies that I might know what I'm talking about. Maybe I put up a lot of equations and name drop a lot of mathematicians and claim they agree with me. Maybe I just sound really authoritative. All of that is peripheral root processing, judging the quality of my argument by how it's delivered. Every act of communication involves both. But if you're trying to sell people on something that's fundamentally irrational, you're going to rely heavily on peripheral root tactics, which is what the winding diatribe and the thought-terminating cliche are. Now, I noticed that these two methods mapped pretty cleanly onto the rhetorical stylings of Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, but here's the question. Cults use these techniques to recruit people. But can I say with any confidence that Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro are trying to recruit people to the alt-right? The thing is, alt-right isn't a term like Klansman. It's more akin to a term like modernism. It's a label applied to a trend. In the same way we debate the line between
Du kannst keine
modernism and
Links posten.
postmodernism, we debate the line between right and alt-right. People don't sign up to be in the alt-right. You are alt-right if you say you're alt-right. But the nature of the alt-right is 90% of them would never admit it.
Ja.
So are Peterson and Shapiro intentionally recruiting people to the alt-right? Are they grifters merely profiting off of the alt-right? Are they even aware that they're recruiting people to the alt-right? Part of my work has been accepting that you can't know for sure.
Ja, und ich denke, das ist tatsächlich nicht das Relevante. Die ernähren sich einfach von etwas, von dem sie auch selber überzeugt sind. Das ist für die einfach ein Win. So wie alle. Ich meine, ich nehme den meisten Leuten ab, dass sie im Prinzip so ungefähr mit dem übereinstimmen, was sie an Content produzieren. Es gibt ein paar Leute, die wirklich aktiv lügen und das überhaupt nicht selber unterschreiben würden, aber die ungefähre Richtung ist dabei. Ja, also ich meine, viele Leute, die Content machen, müssen wegen der Kasualisierung sich von ihren Inhalten entfremden, das ist klar, aber im Prinzip erzählen sie sich trotzdem eine Geschichte darüber, dass es im Prinzip richtig ist, was sie tun. Und diese Leute, die sind einfach überzeugt und lost.
I think it would be naive to say they're unaware. When they give speeches, they get Nazis in their Q&As, and they know that. But how aware are they? I suspect Shapiro more so than Peterson, but that's just my gut talking, and I can't prove it. Like 90% of the alt-right, it's debatable. I don't know if they're trying to be part of this system. I just know they're not trying not to be. Final academic term before we say goodnight that's been making the rounds among lefty YouTubers is stochastic terrorism. There's a really great video about this by the channel Non-Compete called The Pewdie Pipeline. Stochastic terrorism is the myriad ways that you can increase the likelihood that someone will commit violence without ever actually telling them to. You simply create an environment in which lone wolf violence becomes more acceptable and appealing. It mirrors the structure of terrorism without the control or culpability. And I hear about this, and I look at the recruitment structure I see approximated in the alt-right, and I remember something I learned much earlier in my research from Bob Altemeyer in his book, The Authoritarians. Altemeyer has been studying authoritarianism for decades. He has a wealth of data, and one thing he observes is that authoritarianism is the few exerting power over the many, which means there's two types of authoritarians: the ones who lead and the ones who follow. Turns out those are completely different personality profiles. Followers don't want to be in charge. They want someone to tell them what to do, to say you're the good guys and put them in charge of punishing the bad guys. They don't even care who the bad guys are. Part of the appeal is that someone else makes that judgment for them. So if you can encourage a degree of authoritarian sentiment in people, get them wanting nothing more than to be ensconced in a totalist system that will take their agency away from them, putting them in the orbit of an authoritarian leader, but no leader presents themselves, can you just kind of appoint one? Like, if you don't have a leader, can you just find yourself an authoritarian and treat him like one? And if he doesn't give you enough directives, can you just make some up?
Nee, Fidelity nicht ganz. Also, er hat gesagt, er versucht so wenig redundant wie möglich zu sein. Aber er hat es ja auch aktiv in diese Playlist reingetan. Also, es ist nicht ganz, es ist nicht das Video nochmal.
And if you don't have recruiters, can you find a conservative who speaks in thought-terminating cliches, mainly just because he thinks they win arguments? Or find a conservative who speaks in meaningless diatribes because he genuinely thinks he's making sense? And then maneuver those speeches and videos in front of the people you want to recruit? If you're sick of waiting for Moses to come down the mountain with the word of God, can you just build your own God from whatever's handy? Every piece of this structure, you can find people, algorithms, and arguments that, put in a sequence, can generate disorganized attachment whether they're trying to or not, which makes every part plausibly deniable, debatable. You just need to make it profitable enough for the ones involved that they don't try to fix it. This is a system created collaboratively, on the fly, with the help of a lot of people from hate movements past, mostly by throwing a ton of shit against the wall and seeing what sticks. The alt-right is a rapidly mutating virus, and the web is the perfect incubator. It very quickly finds a structure that works, and it's a structure we've seen before, just
Ja, und das liegt ja auch daran, dass alle anderen im Wettbewerb wegsterben, ne? Also das ist Evolutionsdruck quasi.
a little weirder this time. I've started calling this stochastic totalism. Now, again, I'm not a professional researcher. I do my homework, but I don't have the background. I have an art degree. This is something I can't prove so much as a way I've come to look at the alt-right that makes sense to me and helps me understand them. And I got a lot of comments from my last video from people who used to be alt-right that echoed my assumptions, but don't take it as gospel. Mostly I wanted to share it because if it can help you make sense of what we're dealing with, I think it's worth putting out there. Thank you.
So, ich mache die Filtereinstellungen wieder rückgängig. Und dann gucken wir noch einen Teil, ne? Also, Filtereinstellungen so. Entfernen. Zack. Oldschool. Gut.
Does it work?
Q&A habe ich keinen Bock drauf. Da versteht man immer nur die Hälfte.
Say, for the sake of argument, it's the start of another week at the office, and you and your coworkers are milling around the break room, putting off getting to work because until you sit down at your desk, the week hasn't actually started. Mostly you're chatting about what you all got up to over the weekend and how you can't wait for the next season of Killing Eve, but then the new guy, who doesn't know any better, starts talking about the healthcare system and what he thinks is wrong with it. The rest of you all know what this means. If talk turns political, you have to hear the opinions of the guy from payroll. Guy from payroll takes issue with the new guy's comments about how patients in many other countries pay less for better outcomes. Guy from payroll thinks overhauling the healthcare system would be a long and difficult process to create a system where he would pay higher taxes and have fewer options. And all for what? He doubts socialized medicine, if it even worked, would be worth the trade-offs, and even lets slip the phrase, "Do Democrats think they can live forever?" To cut the tension, someone starts talking about their kids who've just started at a new school. But talking about school leads to talking about safety drills, and talking about safety drills leads to talking about school shootings, and now the new guy's on gun reform. And he speaks passionately about how easily monsters can get their hands on assault rifles. But payroll counters that even if you get rid of every gun in the country, criminals will just import them. A bad person can always find a way to do bad things, and why should he, as a responsible gun owner, be punished for the crimes of a monster? There is, again, an uncomfortable silence. Guy from payroll fiddles with his tie. He doesn't like this any more than you, he just can't help himself. Someone tries to change the subject, but by now, new guy is looking to win an argument, so he steers you straight to Roe v. Wade. And payroll is off and running, talking about how beautiful childhood is and how wonderful it is to be a parent, and how it's tragic for any life to be cut short before it begins, and how evil it is to have state-sanctioned, but new guy just can't keep his mouth shut. He says, if you wanted fewer abortions, you would promote comprehensive sex education and easy access to contraceptives, because that's all that has ever reliably lowered abortion rates in any country. All making it a crime does is determine whether the abortion happens in a doctor's office or a motel room. It is deathly silent. People shuffle in place. Finally, without making eye contact, the guy from payroll just says, "Ugh, I hate Mondays." Everybody shuffles off to their cubicles, scowling more at the new guy than at the guy from payroll, and another week officially begins. Much as it pains me to admit, Guy from payroll has made one genuinely good point this morning. Mondays suck. It is a truth universally acknowledged that the work week will end talking about how great Fridays are and begin 3 days later lamenting the scourge of Mondays. But what are you gonna do? We could start work on Tuesdays and end on Saturdays, but that's just kicking the can down the week. The cold reality is, week's gotta start somewhere, and even your most unlikable coworker has a right to complain about it and get sympathy. But why am I talking about it? I'm a YouTuber. Mondays only suck for people with real jobs.
Yeah.
Well, because what I want you to understand today is that the conservative thinks about people dying of preventable illnesses, school shootings, and back alley abortions the way you think about Mondays. The conservative mindset tends to sort things into binaries with no room for scale. Mass shootings either happen or they don't. You can talk about how much safer countries with robust gun control are, and they'll just say, here's a shooting that happened in England. Here's a shooting that happened in Australia. Gun control didn't stop them. You can't regulate evil. And this is the kind of sentence that can drive you up the wall, because it is, on its face, obviously true, but it's only applicable in this context thanks to the word that's implied but not stated. You can't regulate all evil. Yes, since they've had gun control, there have been shootings in England and Australia. Does it matter that these shootings are far less deadly and happen far less often? Does it matter that making guns harder to get has saved tens of thousands of lives? Like, do we really need to explain why stores put junk food you know you shouldn't buy right next to the checkout counter? Because the easier it is to do a thing, the more it happens. Mm-hmm. The mentality here is that if you can't stop every shooting, you shouldn't bother stopping any. If you can't save every life, there's no point improving healthcare. Exactly. Nothing short of literally defeating death will be good enough. It is a wholesale rejection of thinking in terms of systems. Notice how Payroll phrases his argument, a bad person can always find a way to do bad things. Person. Singular. If a criminal can still get a gun, they extrapolate that every criminal can get a gun, in the same way that if a poor person can get a job, every poor person can get a job. Which, no! If there are fewer jobs than people who need them, there's going to be unemployment. And if there are fewer guns than people who want to shoot them, there's going to be less gun crime. If they talked about populations of people, they'd have to acknowledge that some percentage succeeds at doing bad things, and a percentage fails. And since percentages are different across cultures, we must have some influence over them. But a binaristic model of things either happen or they don't leaves no room for percentages. Was there a shooting? Then there is still evil in the world. A conservative will generally agree with you about what the ills of society are: bigotry, violence, disease, oppression, poverty. But they don't view them as problems to be solved. They are facts of life. Mm-hmm. Of course, racism is terrible. But it's a Monday. Trying to fight racism is like trying to fight the first law of motion. The only reason to even talk about it is to commiserate. Besides, if we didn't have bad white people, how would we know we're the good ones? Morality to them is not about fighting evil. It is a set of shared opinions on what evil is. When bad things happen, we sit around agreeing that they are bad, and anyone who says otherwise, we excommunicate. That's what talking about tragedy is for. And I think it's why they get so mad at us when we politicize tragedies, as in, when yet another shooting happens, we talk about what could be done to prevent them. It's not just that they refuse to do anything about the problem, though it is
ja, oder dass alle Ausländer raus müssen.
Definitely that. It's that we're not participating in the ritual of thoughts and prayers. Solemnity is how we perform our morals after a crisis. How do they know where we stand if we don't participate? If evil can't be regulated, but we're saying guns can? Are we saying the shooting wasn't evil? And on its face, this seems completely contradictory to all the other things they claim to believe. Sometimes you want to scream at Payroll. How can you think regulating guns won't reduce shootings, but somehow regulating women will reduce abortions? But here's the real kicker. He doesn't. Yep. He doesn't think illegalizing abortions will make them happen less. What he wants is to throw people in jail for getting them. Mm-hmm. It's right there in how he talks about gun rights. Why should I be punished for the crimes of a monster? To him, the law isn't about shaping society. It's about who gets punished. In this view, human nature is immutable. People are going to be gay and do crime and get abortions and take drugs. And the law is not there to guide. It is there to judge. It is there to sanctify one particular walk of life as the right way. The reason they're opposed to contraceptives and sex ed is not because they don't work, but because they shouldn't work. It doesn't even matter that kids who get abstinence-only education have...
Es geht nur darum, dass sie sich persönlich so fühlen und sie fühlen, dass es so richtig sein muss. Ne? Das alles. Und das wird übrigens im Buch von Sapolsky auch richtig geil klar gemacht, ne? Wir empfinden einen total First-Order Glücksgefühl rasch, wenn wir sehen, wie jemand, von dem wir denken, dass er ein schlechter Mensch ist, bestraft wird dafür, dass er ein schlechter Mensch ist. Das kickt schon bei kleinen Kindern rein. Und es gibt Versuche mit Affen und mit kleinen Kindern und die sind fast identisch, bloß dass die Kinder sogar höhere Ordnung von Bestrafung geil finden. Also wir finden es geil, wenn wir beobachten, dass jemand scheiße ist, danach bestraft wird, und wir finden es sogar geil, wenn das von jemand anders gemacht wird, gar nicht daran teilgehabt hat, an was auch immer da stattfand, und Kinder gehen sogar hinterher in den anderen benachbarten Raum, wenn sie sehen, gegenüber in dem bespiegelten Raum, gehen die jetzt in den anderen Raum. Die Affen stört das nicht, aber die Kinder gehen noch mit durch die andere Tür und gucken sich das dann an und wollen, dass wieder bestraft wird.
Just as much sex as the ones who learn about condoms, acknowledging that teenagers have sex is saying it's okay, and abstinence says it's not. And if it doesn't work, it's because you're just not trying hard enough. More abstinence, more abstinence. It's nothing to do with the way the world is, but the way they want it to present. As the philosopher Taylor Schwiesel once said, shade never made anybody less gay. But if shade crams all the queer people back into the closet, that's how it will look to straight folks. The goal is to communicate which types of people have to fear law enforcement and which get to admire them.
Mhm.
And once you see the conservative view of laws and customs as mapping a path we are meant to walk and punishing deviation,
Das war ein
you
geiles
start
Bild,
to
ne?
see why we have a religious
schwarzen
right
Kopf.
and not so much a religious left. It describes a world drenched in
Ja,
sin
fuck.
that cannot be cleansed from the inside, but walk the path, you might save yourself. Punish those who stray, you might save them as well. And you can see how talking in terms of systemic problems and harm reduction just
Nee, Aldiboy, das hat mit Herdentrieb nichts zu tun. Es geht darum, dass wir uns befriedigt fühlen, wenn wir Bestrafung beobachten. Für etwas, von dem wir glauben, dass es schlecht war. Der Punkt ist, wir würden, also es ist auch sozusagen bekannt, dass wir eine höhere, es würde uns mehr bringen, wenn wir eine Kommunikation über das, was da bestrafenswert ist, beobachten könnten. Das ist aber sozusagen in unserem Belohnungssystem, kickt das nicht so eine harte Flanke rein. Es ist nur nachhaltiger. Hinterher sagen die Leute, was weiß ich, wenn sie beobachtet haben, wie dann Todesstrafe vollstreckt wurde, dass ihnen mit ihrem Schmerz überhaupt nicht geholfen ist. Dass sie auch 30 Jahre später mit was auch immer für eine Straftat da stattgefunden hat, sie damit immer noch nicht copen können. Ne? Und es gibt ja nur wenige Justizsysteme, die so krass sind wie die in Skandinavien. Ne? Aber im Prinzip so in die Richtung skandinavisches Justizsystem ist das, was wissenschaftlich gesehen am besten funktioniert, um Leute mit ihrer Trauer nicht alleine zu lassen.
bounces off of that. It's like saying it's better to die with one unconfessed mortal sin on your soul than 7. Nope. Nope. You're still going to hell. And what good is it to talk about populations? This is about you. Evil exists to test your integrity. When your soul is judged at the gates of heaven, you will stand alone. And if God still hasn't rewarded your faithfulness, you must not have been pious enough. More piety. More piety. This is not to say that reactionary conservatives in the US are just a pack of Catholics. In fact, they're quite the trail mix. We got Protestants, pagans, a surprising number of atheists. But maybe you're familiar with the term Christian atheist? I don't mean the school of philosophy that's about following the teachings of Christ but not believing in his divinity, but colloquially, the philosophy of I don't believe in God, but the God I don't believe in is Jehovah. It's a person who, despite not being a Christian, has a set of ethics clearly informed by a Christian upbringing or by living in a not officially but in practice Christian nation.
Yeah.
Regardless of creed, this is the dominant morality of the United States. And it spans the whole political spectrum. Take, for example, the often liberal sentiment, I refuse to vote for the lesser of two evils. There is no consequentialist argument for this. Perhaps if you and an organized bloc of citizens threatened to withhold your votes in order to influence policy, but as a purely individual act, the consequentialist would argue your goal is to achieve the most ethical outcome. and that if there are two evils and one or the other is going to be in a position of power, voting for the lesser is more ethical than staying home. The consequentialist would argue you are just as responsible for the results of your inaction as for the actions you take. When both options are terrible, all you can do is mitigate the damage. But that's not generally the way it feels. It feels like refusing to participate or choosing someone you want to win but whom you know isn't going to is the more ethical option. That voting for the lesser is a moral compromise. This feeling is independent of results. It doesn't mitigate damage, it doesn't reduce harm, but it does preserve your integrity. That feeling is very powerful. Many politicians have staked their careers on it. Our society has always told us that voting for any flavor of evil will leave a stain on our souls. And it continues to feel this way even among people who no longer believe in souls. The greatest difference between left and right is simply in how common and how intense this feeling is. This is why fascism can be so enticing to the religious and irreligious alike, why they have such an easy time making inroads with conservatives. Because fascism is politics as faith. There's a reason the Nazis talked about the Übermensch. They didn't reject the framework that evil is ancient and the world is polluted and nothing short of divine intervention can save it. They said the world could be saved and only by them, because to the other races, Aryans are as gods. And which would you rather believe? In the left's framework, we are the cause of all the world's problems. But to hear the fascists tell it, everyone else is the cause and we're the solution.
Ja.
So conservatives can brush off moderate change as impossible, yet embrace people who promise to turn the whole world inside out, because nothing short of that is worth trying. I would caution against assuming this mentality is a natural outgrowth of Christianity or paganism or atheism. It is a perversion not representative of any belief system save itself. It spreads because people in power spread it, and people listen when they want their egos flattered and their sins absolved and to be folded into an authority structure that privileges them. They'll do what it takes to conform whatever beliefs they came in with to it. The necessary counter-narrative is to stress that the problems we face are not natural features of the world. That, in fact, very little of human life is natural, and
Ja.
even if it were, what is...
So argumentiere ich ja mittlerweile auch, ne? Also im Prinzip ist fast alles, womit wir strugglen, ein direktes Resultat aus unserem Kontrollzwang. Ne? Also weil wir uns in Hierarchien organisieren, erzeugen wir damit Probleme und dann können wir sie nicht lösen. Mit Hierarchien.
Is natural is not necessarily what is right. The way nature deals with a pandemic is to let everyone without a genetic resistance to the illness die, and if what's left is not a stable breeding population, you go extinct. That's natural. Humanity as we know it only exists in defiance of nature. Every form of bigotry, every means of oppression, is a thing we created. They are human problems, and they have human solutions. They have not always existed, and there are places in the world where they are being addressed. And the idea that the worst things on Earth have no...
Richtig, Aldiboy. Und ich habe sogar schon das hergeleitet, woher das eigentlich kommt mit der Kontrolle. Also warum das sozusagen in die Turing-Maschinen, die wir ja sind, so reingebacken wird. Obwohl wir auch eine Ambivalenz dazu haben können, prinzipiell.
Great significance that most evil is a chaotic mess born of human fallibility can be very depressing to consider. It can also be empowering. This is a secular view. It can be reconciled with spirituality, but not with reactionary fundamentalism, which is the point. And it can be kind of baffling to assert that when bad things happen, maybe we should do something about it. But you just can't take for granted that when someone agrees a thing is bad, they're agreeing it's a problem. But if you cross that hurdle, again, not with the people spewing bullshit, but the people they're trying to convince, you may find incrementalism still doesn't do anything for them. They may still long for something more dramatic. And frankly, a lot of us feel the same. So maybe that's a gateway to talking about deeper change. Because we don't need to be as gods to turn the world inside out.
Du, 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 du. Du, 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 du. Ah, 50 Minuten. Das ist mir zu lange.